In this podcast, we're going to explore the 6 common components that make great teaching identified by the Sutton Trust through our subject lens, considering examples of what each of these might look like in the mathematics classroom. You've had the opportunity to reflect on these attributes in line with the type of teacher you want to be and consider how they might be demonstrated in mathematics from your own perspective as a novice teacher of mathematics. You're now going to hear from an expert teacher perspective. My name is Jackie Stoffels and I'm a subject development lead at Teach First with over 10 years experience teaching in the secondary mathematics classroom and over 5 years experience working in initial teacher training. I'm joined today by our head of mathematics, Jeff Baddock, who has over 30 years of secondary mathematics experience under his belt, having held numerous senior leadership, ITT and teaching and learning responsibilities. We're going to share with you today some of our experiences from our time in the mathematics classroom. So hello, Jeff, and thank you for joining me today.
Hi, Jackie. Glad to be here.
So our novice teachers have been asked to reflect on what the core components of great teaching identified in the Sutton Trust report might look like within the mathematics classroom and the challenges that they might face in developing these areas of their practice that are unique to mathematics. And I'm hoping we can share some of our experiences with them today. So the first component that they've been asked to consider is pedagogical content knowledge. So I'm really keen to hear your thoughts on how this is unique in mathematics.
For many of our novice teachers, they'll have been very successful in mathematics. They will have learned processes quite quickly, achieved great success. And it's true to say that a lot of mathematics teaching in the past has been focused on process, how to get the right answer, how to solve an equation, how to solve a problem, without necessarily understanding the mathematics that underpins those approaches. One of my personal bugbears is the idea of BIDMAS, which, as we know, is an acronym to help us remember the order of operations. It's often taught as BIDMAS as opposed to order of operations, even though this isn't how it's presented in the national curriculum. And what ends up happening is that children learn this method by rote. When they approach problems that involve order of operations, they write down the letters BIDMAS and attempt to apply the rote learned process, and they get it wrong, because they don't understand the mathematics that underpins it. They've been taught a method without understanding why. And for me, one of the biggest changes I've seen in the way mathematics is taught over the last 30 years or so is our focus on the why, not just the how, and how we develop pupils' understanding of the underlying mathematics behind and underneath the processes. The NCETM has as one of its big 5 ideas, the idea of representation and structure. And one of the most impactful things for me in terms of helping children see the underlying structures, the underlying mathematics, are manipulatives like algebra tiles and visual representations like bar modelling, which help children to see what's going on mathematically and therefore develop their understanding rather than simply just learning a method, getting the answer right or wrong, and not really understanding why they did what they did. For us as mathematics teachers, understanding why children get things wrong is really important. And if all you're doing is teaching a process rather than getting them to understand mathematics and getting the chance to talk about mathematics, you will not get to the root of the reason why they're getting things wrong.
Thanks, Jeff. I completely agree, and some really lovely reflections there, which actually link quite nicely into the next component that the Sutton Trust talk about, which is all to do with quality of instruction. So this is all about how you communicate the mathematics in the classroom. And I think this links nicely because sometimes you can go into teaching and let's imagine that I'm teaching adding and subtracting fractions, for example. I might sit and plan a really beautiful script for how I'm going to communicate the process of adding and subtracting fractions. So maybe I start with, okay, first step, let's consider the denominators. Looking for the lowest common multiple, identifying that that's going to become our common denominator. And then I go into explaining how to write equivalent fractions so that both fractions are written over that common denominator. And then we add the numerators together, and then maybe there's some simplifying at the end. And I could write a really beautiful detailed script talking pupils through that process. I might break it down visually on the board into really clear steps and narrate my thought processes as I go. And then I go through that model and then I hand over to the pupils and let them go off on their own to complete some independent practice and try some problems by themselves. and then they get stuck and they can't progress through it. And as a novice teacher, I might sit and scratch my head and go, but I've made it really clear, I've broken it into steps, I've shown it really neatly on the board. Why don't they understand? Why can't they follow this? But it's because instruction is so much bigger than that in maths. There's lots of other things that are going to influence whether pupils are successful beyond the script that's prepared to model the process. And linking to what you've just said, Jeff, things like, how do we make this process visual to the students? How do we make it so that they understand not only what they're doing, but why they're doing it as well? Why is having a common denominator important in this situation? And have we really unpicked that for them, or are we just giving them a list of steps to replicate and work through? And another thing that we might want to consider as well is whether they have the prerequisite knowledge that they need to access that explanation. If I'm asking them to look for a lowest common multiple, do they actually know how to do that? Have I checked that they're fluent in that skill, that they can recall that skill first? Otherwise, they're going to get stuck in that first step, and they're not going to be able to access the instruction there for new learning. So when we're planning our instruction, it might be like here that our main goal or objective of the lesson is to add and subtract fractions, but I need to think really carefully about how I'm going to break that learning down into digestible chunks and sequence them really thoughtfully to make sure that pupils are ready to receive the new learning and progress in an incremental way towards the new skill.
Absolutely. And just to add that, Jackie, you're right that this links to pedagogical content knowledge. Because if you don't know the prerequisite knowledge that the children need, then they're not going to achieve success because they won't have those skills to hand when you start teaching the new topic.
Definitely. And there's so much overlap between the different components in this Sutton Trust report. It's really hard to think of examples that slot beautifully into just one of them, because they really do intertwine. So let's think about the next one then. The next one on the list is classroom climate. And I know you've got some thoughts on this one, Jeff, to share.
Yes, this is a really important topic. Mind you, they all are. But sometimes it's overlooked because fundamentally what you value is what will become the climate in your classroom. And if in mathematics you value how well children do in the end of unit tests and whether they get the question right or wrong, then that will become the climate of your classroom. And that's not a climate for learning. We want a climate for learning that rewards and encourages effort, that encourages children to learn from their mistakes, and encourages children to be open to their misconceptions, which is an erroneous belief. More of that to come later in the course content, I'm sure. Because if you don't unpick their misconceptions, they'll continue with those misconceptions right through to the end of their compulsory learning. A typical misconception is something like, when you're adding two fractions, say you're adding a half and a quarter, and you get 2/6, because a common misconception is that you add the numerators and you add the denominators. Whereas what you need to be creating in a successful mathematics classroom is a culture of rewarding effort, so that when children make mistakes, they're not penalised, not made to feel embarrassed, they're not made to feel failures. They learn from those mistakes, and that we expose misconceptions, and you have the opportunity to learn from other people's misconceptions. So if someone's got a question wrong, you interrogate why they've got that wrong, and then you build on that and they move forward. So your climate has to be one for success, that values children being open to making mistakes and learning from mistakes, and values effort, not just focused on how well you do on the test at the end of the unit or the end of the year.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Completely agree again. You're completely right. And yes, we are going to look at misconceptions and why they might occur, along with some examples of them a bit later on in this course, alongside the idea of errors in general and how commonly perceived ideas that maths is something that's either right or wrong, and how we can kind of influence those pupils' beliefs on this topic in our classroom as well. So classroom climate, again, links really quite nicely into the next component, which is all about classroom management, because how you manage your classroom can have an impact on climate. And when considering classroom management and sort of thinking ahead for this discussion, I tried to think if there were any horror stories from my time in the classroom I could share, particularly ones that are unique to mathematics. And the best one I could come up with is the first time I tried to use multi-link cubes in my classroom. Those little interlocking multicolored cubes, you can stack them together and use them for a variety of things, and they're a really great resource. And I remember early in my career, sort of linked to this idea of using manipulatives and representations and really trying to unpick the why behind the mathematics. I remember as probably a teacher when I was training, I think it was, I was using them to teach area of a rectangle. So you can ask pupils to build a rectangle with a width of 5 and a height of 3, and then work out what the area is and use those cubes to visualize the link between the width and the height and the area of the rectangle. And I was, really proud of myself as a novice teacher, planning this lovely hands-on interactive activity for my pupils. Really keen to get in the classroom, and I beautifully planned my resources and my explanations. But what I hadn't planned for is the fact that when you get multi-link cubes out, students have this innate compulsion to build anything out of them other than what you've actually asked them to build. So yeah, while I planned my lesson beautifully in the resources and the progression and how I was breaking it down, what I'd not really thought deep enough about is how I was going to manage the resource source in terms of behaviors, routines, expectations, etc. And a lot of you were sort of saying about manipulatives earlier, and they're really great for this exposure of the underlying mathematical structure, and they are such a powerful learning resource. But we really have to make sure our behavior management routines and expectations are really slick when using them. We've got to make sure that we communicate our expectations with our pupils. When can they touch them? When are they not allowed to? What can they create from them? What shouldn't they be doing with them? And we need to uphold these expectations as well. Like if they're not meeting them, we need to make sure we're following through with behavior policies. A good approach is to use them within your own modelling. So don't just leave it for don't just let them put their hands on them when you like set them off on some independent practice. Really model for them how to use it in your explanations. You show them how to use them yourselves, and then work through an example together where they're using them alongside you. And as I said, just really be strict on those routines and be straight on anybody that isn't following your expectations, and use the behavior management policy to help manage that. And I guess multi-link cubes aren't an example of a resource that all teachers are going to be using on a daily basis, but something that you see in a lot of mathematics classrooms that again requires really carefully monitored routines is mini whiteboards. And some of our novice teachers might well have seen these modelled already in observations that they've done in the classroom. And they're an amazing assessment tool to use in mathematics. Like we're really lucky in our subject that we have something that allows us to collect whole class feedback so readily. But if you don't manage the way they're used, and they're used irresponsibly, it can really interrupt the pace of the lesson and how effective they actually are, and how much they actually support pupil progress. So it's really important that, again, planning routines and spending time early in the year drilling those routines and expectations for pupils. It's just so important. As important in thinking about those routines as much as it is how you're actually going to demonstrate the mathematics as well. So on to component number 5, and I think this next one's super interesting, because I think it can sometimes get a bit forgotten about when you're so focused on developing your pedagogy, concentrating on your behaviour management, building those routines. I think this one maybe kind of gets lost. It's maybe where we sort of start our journey into teaching, but maybe one that gets pushed to the back of our minds as we really get into the teaching practice. But I think it's possibly one of the most important ones because it really underpins all the decisions that you make in your classroom. And this is the component centred on teacher beliefs. And Jeff, I'm going to ask you to share your perspective on this one with us.
You're absolutely right. This underpins everything. Your beliefs about the teaching of mathematics and people's success in mathematics will influence your day-to-day practice and ultimately how well the children do. But for new teachers, how you were taught mathematics at school will still have a big influence over how you think mathematics should be taught and possibly how you start teaching mathematics in the classroom. And one of the things that many of us experienced at school was the idea of setting. Now's not the time to delve into the positives and the negatives of setting, but setting does affect your expectations of children. I became a senior vice principal at a large successful comprehensive in South Yorkshire. And in the second week, we had an interesting conversation with the second in department some years ago now, before the reformed GCSEs. And he said to me, Jeff, we get A stars, A's and B's out of set 1, and we get B's and C's out of set 2. We get C's and a few D's out of set 3. And then sets 4, 5, and 6, we'll get D's and below. We never get a grade C below set 3. That was his fixed belief. And it was a belief shared by the majority of the mathematics department. Their results were around about 55 to 60% A star to C year on year. 3 years after that, we hit 85% A star to C. And that level of success continued under the new GCSE reforms because we changed the beliefs of the mathematics department. The national curriculum talks about all pupils becoming fluent, reasoning mathematically, and solving problems. The NCETM talks about all children making progress. And what's really important, linked to your classroom climate, is your expectation of pupils. There's no such thing as the maths gene. There is no such thing as fixed ability. I'll give you an example of a young lady. Her name was Sally. She was in set 5 in year 8 when I started at that school, and had been told by the head of mathematics in no uncertain terms, you will never get a grade C. When she left at the end of year 11, she got a grade C because we had changed our beliefs about what she could achieve, and therefore she did achieve.
Yeah, and I think any of us that have taught for a long time can recall an experience like that. And sometimes it's an individual like this that really highlights your mindset needs to change. Like when they do achieve something beyond what the progress measures predict that they should achieve, it really, it really sort of inspires you to step back and reflect. And again, sometimes it takes somebody coming in from the outside, moving across from a different school with another belief to really help a department see how things could be done differently. But I feel like I keep saying, and this links to this component because these components are just so intertwined. But the last component in the Sutton Trust publication is all about professional behaviours. And I really want to hone in on the professional development aspect of this, largely because it was something that for the few years after completing my PGC and gaining QTS just wasn't really at the forefront of my mind. And it doesn't mean I wasn't developing my practice, because I was still a novice teacher. I was still learning from my experience in the classroom, but I wasn't really looking outside of the department I was in. And we became quite stuck in a bubble of having a particular way of thinking and a particular way of doing things and particular sets of resources that we used. And at the time, professional development wasn't as accessible as it is now. We've got a lot more access to online resources, conferences, seminars, etc. Ones that would have used to only be accessible if you could get somewhere in person, are now accessible online as well, and you can record them, you can access them later. You can sign up to mailing lists, you can follow blog posts and podcasts. I can listen to professional development on my dog walk, or on your commute in the morning. And so I think that's really great that it is so accessible. But back at that time, it wasn't as accessible for me. And so the real game changer for me in terms of my professional development and breaking from this bubble and changing my mindset was about 5 years into teaching, when I became much more aware of the NCETM, which you mentioned earlier. It's the National Centre for Excellence in Teaching Mathematics. And at the time, they were really promoting their Teaching for Mastery programme. And I'm not going to go into detail. We've again mentioned it earlier, talking about things like visual representations and manipulatives. I'm not going to go into detail about Teaching for Mastery now, as it comes up later in the study for this course. But I signed up for a programme, and it involved some workshops, and then putting what I learned into practice, reflecting on it, and then feeding it back in the next workshop I went to. And it was really influential for me, and not just because of the content of the work group, not just because I was learning about this Teaching for Mastery, though there was loads of great things I took from that really transformed my practice, but really the fact it got me outside of my classroom bubble, outside of my school bubble, and discussing new ideas and different teaching approaches in maths education, and learning from other people that were subject experts, or just from different contexts, and just really people that were enthusiastic about it as well. It was just really refreshing to have those discussions with a variety of people and hear about various experiences that were just different from my own, and how their departments were doing things different. And then it gave me lots of new things that I could take back into my department. I became really interested in the use of manipulatives at this point. Bit of a theme today, but we like a golden thread. So I took like that element back particularly, and thought about how we could use them to explore underlying structures in mathematics within our department and our curriculum. And my head of department at the time, I think we just had a change in head of department, which was nice as well. She was much more interested in us looking for new ways of doing things. And so I led some training sessions in my department to help us integrate these ideas and manipulatives into our scheme of work. And sort of really influence the way the department as a whole were going to teach certain parts of the curriculum. Now, if I'd not stepped out of my classroom and attended that course and spoken to other people and had the opportunity to reflect and discuss, I'm not even sure if I heard a podcast on it or read a blog post, to be honest, that it really wouldn't have had the same effect. It was that, that networking and that discursive experience. If I hadn't done that, I really wouldn't have been as inspired to take that action and inspire that change in my department. So, I really truly believe it's part of our responsibility as teachers to keep our knowledge current, and also kind of cast our net wide in terms of who we're talking to within mathematics education and education in general, and draw additional experiences into our classroom. So the NCETM are a really good place to start if you're interested in professional development or people in your department. I do check them out, and the things like work groups that they offer and the training that you can complete with them as well. Even from the point of gaining QTS, there are ECT work groups that you can get involved with, so you don't have to wait 10 years or 5 years until you hear about them somewhere to get involved. And there really are out there loads and loads of opportunities for teachers at any stage of their career to keep building on their pedagogy and subject knowledge.
I absolutely agree, Jackie, and I often use this example. My GP's been my GP now for over 30 years. He's a good personal friend. But if he was still practicing medicine in the same way he was when I first knew him 30 years ago, he wouldn't be my GP now. And I think that's a good example to share, to highlight why engaging in professional development is something that needs to be done, needs to be a core responsibility for us from the moment we start teaching to right till we get to the end of our careers.
Well, a huge thank you, Jeff, for joining me on this podcast today and sharing your expertise. I'm sure there's loads of things that our novice teachers can take away from our experience, and it won't be long before they're adding their own experiences to the mix as well. Thank you very much for your time today.
You're very welcome. It's been an absolute pleasure.